Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or evening, whatever you happen to be, your time when you're watching this. We're excited to be here today for our fourth video in our Quaker Libertarian Conversation series. We're going to be talking today about render unto Caesar and the implications of that in the broader culture and in the scriptural tradition. My name is Matt Hisrich. I'm the founder of Quaker Libertarians, and I'm here with the esteemed Juliet Nail and Jared Warner, who are going to be part of the conversation today. Let's take a moment to center down. All right, thank you. I'm going to stop screen sharing here, if I can remember how to do that. There we go. Hello, Jared. Hello, Juliet.
Hello.
Hello.
So this passage, render unto Caesar, has been used in broader culture and within the Christian tradition to indicate, at least in my experience, it's often used as a basic command to pay your taxes as a good citizen wherever you happen to be a citizen, and kind of in an American context, separation of church and state. Give God what's God's, give Caesar what's Caesar's, in our case, the United States government. And that's a very clean and tidy interpretation. So I'm wondering, one, if we can provide a little context for that passage in Scripture, and then have some conversation about how we might interpret that. And Jared, I'm wondering, we've had some back and forth on Facebook message about this within the Scripture. Can you tell us a little bit more about where does this show up and what's going on?
Well, the words render under Caesar are in 3 of the Gospels. They're all a test to Jesus from religious leaders, some of which are political type leaders, and some are just people that are within the religious faith. But it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in some form or another. And they all are testing Jesus as to whether or not it's lawful or if it's proper to pay taxes or tribute to the Roman government. And the way Jesus speaks about that question is he asks another question saying, whose image is on the coin to pay the tax and whose inscription is on that? And they show him the coin, and they say, well, it's Caesar's. And he says, render under Caesar what is Caesar's, and render under God what is God's, or give to God what that's God's. So that's kind of the context of those 3 passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not in John, so that's kind of a interesting thing. But the fact that it's in 3 of the Gospels means that it's probably something pretty important to the gospel writers. So is that a good short answer?
It's an excellent summary. I was hoping you would do just that. Thank you, Jared. So I'm wondering for both of you so what I expressed as kind of what I've heard in sermons and culture, that kind of thing. Is that consistent with your experience? Have you heard it interpreted in different ways? Before we get into what we might say as Quaker Libertarians.
I mean, I usually see that as a justification and excuse for Christians to submit to government, no matter what government says. And it sounds like there are other passages that also say you have to, God appointed authority, so you have to follow the authority. Obviously from my perspective, I come from a different bias, but that's what I see out there.
And likewise, I might have, my internet's not working that great, so I apologize if I missed something. But I hear a lot of people saying, justifying whatever government does by saying, using these verses in that context. But I think it's missing the point of the verses if you don't read them in a fuller context. I mean, it was a test because there were two different views, and they're trying to corner somebody into saying one thing or another in the hopes that they would discredit their stance within the population. And I think that's kind of what a lot of people try to do. I mean, with the presidential debates and all that, all they're trying to do is ask questions that will brand these individuals into a corner, so to speak, and therefore you can't listen to them. And people are using those scriptures to do. And I think that's a wrong use of scripture.
Right, because in this context, Jesus is either going to get in trouble with the Roman government or get in trouble with the Jewish leaders, right? If he's, depending on his answer, and they think, okay, we've got him, he's got to answer one way or the other, right?
Right. That's the hope anyway, is we ask questions that we assume only have two answers, and it's either a yes or a no, or a right or a wrong, and there's no third option. And a lot of times that keeps us from thinking outside of the box, so to speak, or looking for a different way of doing things. And that's, to me, it's just it's unethical for one thing, as far as I think. But it is also, is there another way of looking at things? And the way that Jesus answers that question is that he believes that there is, because he avoided answering the yes and no, and he goes to a different place. Hey, if the coin bears Caesar's image, then the coin's Caesar's. But let's give God what's God's.
Okay, now we're pivoting here. We're going into interpretation, which is always dangerous because, as Juliet pointed out, everybody has their own biases. But if you're watching this video, this is a Quaker Libertarian video, so you're going to get that interpretation. And I think I have at least 3 issues with the sort of standard interpretation of this passage. And we'll see what the two of you think about this. But one, when we think of how Jesus operates in terms of either sharing parables or when he's put in these corner positions and finds a third way, it's very rare that, at least I see Jesus saying, okay, it's this, it's very clear, right? Most of the time, Jesus is in Scripture calling us to deeper interpretation, calling us to question how we normally would do things, calling us to not just do what we've always done, that kind of thing. And so what's going on with this passage? Can we make it as simple as it's often portrayed? Caesar, God, it's that clear? Or are we supposed to stop a minute and pause and say, well, okay, what's going on? Now, if we do that, then I think it's important to recognize this separation of church and state thing is relatively new in human history, right? Like for much of history, church and state were intertwined. And if it is the case that, which is my understanding it was, in Roman times, Caesar was not just like president, Caesar was God, right? And so there was this very clear understanding that you were to pay not just your taxes, but pay worship to the divine presence that was the leader of the Roman Empire. And so to say, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, is in one way saying, render to the Roman God what's the Roman God's, and render unto God, period, what is God's. In my mind, that becomes a much more a challenging, provocative statement than simply state and church and separate out in a very clean way. Because the other piece that comes in there, this is sort of the third piece, is Jesus saying God owns this portion and Caesar owns this portion, and the world is divided up into those two, because it seem in my mind all of creation is God's, right? And so can we say, just divide it out and say, okay, this portion is the government's, and they're in charge of all that? I don't know. What do the two of you think?
I mean, for me, I see divine authority is obviously always above. So I interpret that to mean if there's a conflict, then I'm going to defer to divine authority over human authority. So, I mean, that's my bias. Yeah, that's kind of my big thing, is it's divine authority. The other thing, I appreciate that you guys put this in context, because in a lot of ways, we're in similar tumultuous times, right? There's some sort of transition going on. What that is going to be is going to be interesting. Is it going to be more tyrannical? Is it going, we're going to end up more free? But it is not going to be the same system we had before, is what it feels like, or at least not the same.
More free. I think we can do that.
Well, we can hope. And then the other piece of what you were saying, that's, I mean, in one way, no, we don't have a system that says that our governmental leader is a god, but people are sure acting like their political tribe is a religion, and people are sure acting like the government is a god. But that might be another topic. So that's my take.
Good take. I like that you brought out all those three points of view, Matt, because they are good points of view, and Caesar was worshipped as a god, and a lot of the cities mentioned in the New Testament that have Caesarea in the name are cities that were dedicated to the worship.
Uh-oh.
We get a little freeze. Jared, are you back with us?
Yeah, are you there? Sorry.
Yeah, just talking about Caesarea.
Yeah, there's several Caesareas in the New Testament, and those were cities that were dedicated to the worship of Caesar. So giving Caesar worship was a very real part of Roman culture, and is in I'm going off on a rabbit trail. I do that quite often, but but yeah, I mean, this is the question: is where do you stand? Is really what Jesus is answering. Are you going to worship Caesar or worship God? It's up to you. And how are you going to how are you going to live your life in regard to that? And how are you going to encourage other people around you to live their lives? And I think that's a big thing, because all the groups that were questioning him were leaders within the community. People to do.
I think you're freezing up again there, Jared. So I'll just pick up on that, because I really like that framing. One of the ways that I've heard this interpreted is that Jesus, the savvy politician, right, who gives a non-answer in order to avoid getting in hot water. But I think if we think about it as Jesus is not ready to die yet, right? And so there is some pragmatism in the answer to not come down hard one way or the other. But the other piece of it is, which gets us out of basically affirming our biases, again, going back to Juliet's earlier comment, Jesus is really inviting us to think about that question. What is God's and what is the state's? And how do you live into that question, which is not a simple question to answer. And I think that is more in keeping with my understanding of who Jesus was and what his ministry was about, to kind of open up our thinking and our faith in ways that weren't just merely going about our business as we always have. And so I see this passage as an invitation for us to sit with and wrestle with.
I like that. I like that interpretation a lot, because and I think that's a very Quaker interpretation, because it goes to, we don't have all the answers, and we have to sit and center and listen and try to discern, what is God telling us to do right now? And one thing for people so I'm in a weird position because I'm a cradle, mostly practicing Catholic. I don't take communion for different reasons. And I have trouble with some of the human authority piece in the Catholicism. But most people don't understand, or some denominations are going to see Quakers, the Quaker discernment of God's will, perhaps as prideful. So I think it's important to you guys that are a little bit more of Quaker authorities, to explain a little bit that there are processes within the Quaker community to help us learn to discern that better. Like we're not pretending to be God. We're trying to listen and be humble and to try to listen. And you know what? I'm not always successful either. So I think discernment is an important place to go or to explore a little bit and explain to people.
Jared, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, put me on the spot.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, there's a really important aspect in discerning the direction forward as a community. And Juliet brought up her history with the Catholic Church, and I've also I haven't been a part of the Catholic Church, but I've been a part of spiritual exercises within the Catholic Church, and they've affirmed a lot of Quaker spiritual practices through that because they're very similar.
Oh no. He froze at an important part. Come back.
We got to get to the big conclusion.
Am I still with you guys?
You're back.
You were talking
Okay.
about the overlap between Quaker discernment and Catholic spirituality.
Okay, so there's a lot of prayer and discernment in some of the Catholic spiritual practices with the spiritual exercises and the Quaker centering. So there can be overlap, and what the good thing is we're not attempting to be God's voice. We're seeking God's voice. And the only way we can do that is if we let God's voice be heard. And it's hard to do, because when you go into a meeting for worship or something like that, you're carrying in everything that you've done that whole week. So the question becomes, what am I bringing in? And with some of the youth over the years, as I've been a pastor, they're like, well, church is boring. I'm like, well, that's because you're bored. So what are you bringing in, and what are you adding to the worship? And are you expecting to be entertained, or are you expecting to listen and hear God's voice? And that's part of what it is. We can get into this God complex where I have the answers, or we can be humble and try to listen. And if we're humble, I believe we can find a good, clear path forward. And it's not always easy, but I think it's possible.
Yeah, and I think that it's also the case that this may not be the same for everybody. And my guess is, even for those who have really wrestled with this passage, the answers are not simple. And so there are friends who have chosen to not pay war taxes and just take that out. And if they get audited by the IRS or serve jail time or get fined or whatever, they're comfortable with that as a stand, because they don't want to render under Caesar for support of violence. And there are those who try to keep their income below the poverty line, so they're not simply not paying taxes. And there are those who continue to pay their taxes like they're supposed to, and but at the same time work against the growth of the state, work against the military and industrial congressional complex, right? All these things, and see that as their witness. So there's this whole range of ways to approach this that aren't a simple cut and dry, render unto Caesar, render unto God, right? I don't know if these are conversations that you've been a part of, if you've heard them in your meeting or your meeting, or amongst your families.
My meeting hasn't done that, but the caretaker at my meeting in San Jose he was originally from Cincinnati, he and his wife, Polly and Amos Brokaw, and they stopped paying taxes in the 60s. And when I knew them, as you said, they kept their income below a certain point and were the caretakers of our meeting house. It was a very small meeting house in San Jose, California. And they lived that out. So, and I like the Quaker call to, I feel like the way that we're going to do that, render unto God what is God's, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, is we're not going to all pick the same hill to die on. We're not all called to live that in the same way. So I really love where you guys have gone with that it's a question. I'm curious as more, so Quakerism, I think, I don't know if our audience is going to be more Quaker or non-Quaker, non-libertarian, but in many types of Quakerism, my type of Quakerism, we don't have pastors, so there's no leaders. I think the traditions you guys come from, there are sort of spiritual leaders, but my sense in Quakerism is that we're not real big on human authority. So I kind of want to know, I don't know where the passage is, you guys probably do, but I really want your opinions on that piece where people are pointing to the passage that says, well, God ordained the human authorities and the human governments, so you just have to do what they say. Now, obviously, Nazi Germany, Stalin, there's lots of places that tell us that's not right, but I would love to hear your guys' take on that.
Well, I will defer to Jared again. I will say that if you're interested in this topic, that Libertarian Christian Institute and AnarchoChristians have spent whole podcasts and blog posts and all that kind of thing about specifically this question of authority. But Jared, do you want to take a swing at it?
I could swing, that's for sure. A lot of that comes from Romans, where it says that it's in Romans 13. Let me pull it up just so I can be a little more authoritative on that. And you hear it a lot in political campaigns and speeches and that sort of thing. Our vice president has used it many times. And it says, let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except for God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So it's saying that there are structures that God has allowed, basically. And there's, you can interpret that in a lot of different ways as well. But the way that I've always looked at it is, if you, being subject can be looked at in several different ways. The way that I have often looked at it is, if you do oppose something within the government, you brought up Nazism and Stalinism, there's aspects of that that a church may not want to participate in. We have to accept the fact that they have the force, the human force, to put us in prison or something like that if we oppose them, and that is being subject to the authority, even in resistance to that authority. So, and I think that's it's one of those areas where we use our biases to try to make Scripture speak for our position. And it may be that, I mean, Paul, when he wrote that, was in prison. So he was submitting to the authority while he was speaking out against that authority. So I think we sometimes forget what historically was going on at that time. And of course, at that time, Christians were not accepted in the Roman culture as being the biggest, or being acceptable. I'm speaking in a circle there. So, but it's one of those things where we have to be, we need to be able to speak to why we're doing things. And I think that's why the Quaker discernment and that sort of thing within ourselves and within our meetings, if we can't speak to why we're doing it, then maybe we need to go back and answer that question again, and be willing to accept whatever fallout comes from that.
Oh, okay. So could that be that last piece? Could that be the key, that we're supposed to follow God's law first? Like, you know, we're not going to, even if government tells us to murder someone, we're not going to do that. But then if we're then subject to losing our own lives, as it sounds like, or being imprisoned, as Paul was, then we accept that punishment. But it's not saying don't stand up for what is right. It's saying pay the price, even if that's the ultimate price.
You mentioned this hierarchy previously, and there's this great Bayard Rustin civil rights activist quote where he says something very similar. Of course, Rustin was Quaker informed and said, if it's a question of a state or God, and you're putting me in that position, I will choose God, and I'll accept whatever may follow from that. And of course, in many cases, civil rights activists were, like, they were beaten and sprayed and all this kind of stuff, imprisoned, and accepted. Yeah, I'm submitting to this, but it doesn't mean that I'm approving it, which is, there's a difference there. And if I think back to the render under Caesar passage and the connection there, my sort of guiding principle would be, if I'm choosing between Caesar and God, I want to expand the range of what God has control over, and delimit the area that Caesar has control over, and not just go along passively, which is, there's a difference between being pacifist and being passive, right? With whatever Caesar says, because, as you're pointing out, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's Stalin, whether it's Hitler, this sort of, but that every day, it's not just these examples from history. Every day we continue to drop bombs around the world and imprison people and et cetera, et cetera. So we are part, whether or not we think of ourselves as part of empire, we are. And so what is our response to that? And I think from my perspective, I don't want Caesar to have any more control. Right? And so how do we work to scale that back in various ways? And that's going to look different for all of us.
And I think that's a good place to start, Matt, because you know, it all begins with how am I going to live my life within this community and in this context. And if we don't live our life how we see as being most beneficial to the community at large and most beneficial to ourselves, how are we actually helping? And that's you know, a lot of, you know, I am a pastor and I am a Quaker, and I've had conversations with coworkers and they're like, why aren't you trying to convert me? And I'm like, well, because that's not my job. And they're like, you're a pastor, that is your job. I'm like, no, it's really not my job. Our tradition says that the Spirit brings us to God. So my job is to live my life in front of you so that you can see that there's a better way. And that's kind of how I approach my life is, am I living a peaceful life? Am I living a simple life? Am I answering a lot of the questions that people might have in my life as I'm working through kind of giving up and letting somebody else take it for me?
And in the best sense of a Quaker query, this doesn't go away. It doesn't get resolved. It continues to live with us. This passage, and we can raise it. And our answers, it's not just one time and we decide. Our answers may look different over the course of our lives too. Well, any final thoughts we want on this passage? Anything to share before we close for the day?
Well, I mean, I think Jared brought us our redemption in the third act, right? It's what, you know, how can I live this out? How can I live my Quaker values, my Christian values of loving my neighbor as myself, and, you know, ideally helping to bring peace, equality, simplicity, truth, integrity, truth, community. You know, how can I do that? And this query, I mean, this passage of exploring, giving unto Caesar, giving unto God what's God's, is, you know, that's the big one. I mean, that's the crux of it, and trying to discern. So thank you for the redemption and the work.
I try.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we will certainly continue the conversation. Look forward to our future videos. Have a great day.